Right, so I know a lot of people have very strong feelings on the finale of The Amazing Digital Circus, but whether you absolutely love it or absolutely hate it, we can all agree on the fact that coming up with headcanons and theories about what happens after the conclusion of the show, or what could have been if things played out a little bit differently, is fun. In fact, the fandom has developed entire sub-communities dedicated to alternate endings for this show, most notably Jax not abstracting or somehow returning from abstraction. But if you want to know my thoughts on that, there's another video you need to go and watch. No, today we're going to be taking a look at what happens when some of the most talented members of this community make entire stories around these hypotheticals. Alternate universe stories, if you will. But a lot of these stories are long, platform specific, and can take a good deal of time to actually read, so should you even bother? That is the question I'm going to help you answer today, as we take 3 of the most popular Digital Circus AUs and compare them. Today's contestants are Replacement Code by ScarBlue17, Encore by Freakfest Fixations, and Control C by Thwarp. All of these comics will be graded out of the same scale on 4 categories. Plots. What is the point of divergence from the canon show? Where does it occur in the series timeline, and how well does it keep inside the rules of the show and itself? Is it an interesting new idea, and do the plotlines that follow on from it work well? Characters. How are the characters portrayed in the comic? Do they align well with how they're presented in the show, and if not, is there a well-explained reason for why? This section will be weighted a little bit more heavily than the others, since so much of the Digital Circus rests on the characters and how they interact, so you really need to get this right. Art style and layouts. How are the comics actually put together? Do the panels flow well within each other, and is the art style clean and consistent across the comic? Finally, reach. How easy is it to access the comic? Is it specific to one platform, and are there any alternative viewing methods or dubs of the comic? So now we have our parameters, let's get things underway by taking a look at the plot of each AU. The Replacement Code AU is a very old product, dating back all the way to 2024 after the release of the pilot, so there are a few details in it that are definitively different since that point. However, I'm going to put the main point of divergence later in the series at episode 8. This is because the core difference in this comic is Kane dies, and the Circus Code, instead of just existing in a quasi-destroyed state like we see in episode 9, goes and chooses a new ringmaster to run the show, giving them the godlike powers of Kane and influencing their mind into acting more like him. Our unfortunate host in this instance is Pomni. The mind manipulation doesn't stop there, however, as the memories of the rest of the cast are altered in such a way that they don't remember Kane and also can't recall their memories with Pomni before she transforms. The exception to this is Jax, who remembers most things just fine. The plot of the AU then goes on to surround the relationship of the rest of the cast with this new version of Pomni and her quest to try to get them to recognize her again. From what I've told you, you may already be thinking, well, why doesn't she just tell them? Boom, problem solved. Well, the key issue in this comic, and the thing that makes it captivating to me, is the fact that Pomni and the Circus AI are locked in a struggle for control over her body, with the Circus winning out most of the time. As a proud Death Note fan, I do appreciate a good internal monologue, and we get plenty of that here, with the writing being very solid, despite the fact that an English speaker like me needs to read the Google translated version. Unfortunately, while the idea of Pomni not telling everyone about herself is addressed in the comic, there doesn't seem to be a clear reason why Jax hasn't done so, as he's not bound by the code of the Circus and can say whatever he wants. He's also shown to have a more developed relationship with Pomni like we see in the back half of the actual series, so he would have at least some desire to help her. The only argument you can make here is that maybe he thinks she's just been killed and is getting puppeteered, but that isn't properly shown. 7 out of 10. Encore follows a much more positive route and takes place after the conclusion of the series, with Kane and King are working together in order to bring back abstracted characters from their eternal turmoil. Well, not all of them, just the ones that the plot is deemed of importance. Now, I'm going to come out and say this is a Funny Bunny romance comic, so I will be discussing that romance later in the character section. What I'm not going to do is start a shipping war based on which one of these characters you think Pomni would be best suited to. Please do your best to keep things civil. That being said, we first start off with Jax waking up in his original circus body before going on a self-proclaimed apology tour for all the people he pissed off or hurt or caused to kill themselves, which goes down surprisingly well. Ribbit and Kaufmo, who have resumed their places in a trio with him, immediately notice the avoidance he has towards Pomni though, and begin to suspect something is up. When this is discovered to be feelings for her, the pair immediately assume the role of good friends and take the absolute piss. A few days later, the lads are out at Zubal's bar, and Jax is failing horrendously at dealing with everyone talking about his feelings for Pomni, while the girls are off stargazing and having some philosophical talk, as you do. Ribbit here finally gets to talk to Pomni properly, and realizes how nice she is, before instant transmissioning herself to the bar and telling Jax to lock the fuck in and not fumble the bag. The rest of the comic is then Jax doing his absolute best to fumble said bag, while Ribbit and Kaufmo work to save him from complete embarrassment, ultimately ending with the Funny Bunny duo locked in a room until they sort it out. Now, considering I made a whole video on why the bring the abstracted character back trope is bad, that is the core criticism for this comic, especially since it's done so easily and has no consequences to speak of later down the line. As for the plot after this point, it follows with the Digital Circus theming quite well, being heavily character focused with whatever they happen to be doing as more of a backdrop for interpersonal moments. It is a lot happier than a Gooseworks style episode, but the whole idea of this AU is more positive than anything Gooseworks would make for this series, so that is kind of expected. The plot being so character driven though means that I can't give this section a very high score, and the one major element it does throw in is really not good. 5 out of 10. Control-C diverges from the main story around the episode 5 mark, with the addition of a new member to the circus, though instead of getting their own unique body and voice, this person appears as an exact copy of Ragatha. Naming herself Annabelle and getting a Player 2 marker above her head for good measure, we get to see how this new character reacts to joining the circus for the first time. As it was stated in episode 9 that Pomni got used to the circus much faster than anyone else, and has a much harder time adjusting and locks herself in her room, which is also, of course, a copy of Ragatha's. In between these 2 points is mostly Kane trying his best to convince Anne to simply be a complete copy of Ragatha for reasons we'll get into later. This is encouraged in the usual snarky tone by Jax, and fought against somewhat sloppily by Ragatha and Zubul. At the end of it all, Kane isn't convinced this is a good idea, but leaves Anne to her devices while planning an introductory adventure that will probably be the content of Chapter 2. Now, as this is designed to be a longer form comic, all we have at the moment is the setup, but it's done in a pretty solid manner with lots of room for expansion. Again, we get a heavy character focus, which lines up with Goose's style, but there isn't a great deal else here yet, and there are minimal changes to the circus structure or rules. 6 out of 10.
Give me a whiskey sour, but hold the egg white, since I'm a vegan.
The main interest in replacement code when it comes to the characters is Pomni and her internal struggle against the circus code. The most important part of this, and the part that I think was done very well, is that Pomni herself maintains all of the characteristics that she has in the main series. Her optimism and critical thinking skills are both very present, and the comic also manages to capture her response to confusing information very well. The morphing of her personality into a Kane-like is also done very well, and even though Kane is not there, you can feel the influence on her actions as though he was puppeteering her. Her interaction with Jax also brings out more of him as we get a sort of half look into the barricaded door scenario from episode 9. Pomni is still sort of here, but functionally Jax can't interact with her anymore. It's not enough to make him abstract because she is still physically present, but he walls himself off even more than we see in canon. Unfortunately, these 2 characters are the only ones I'm able to offer a positive stance on for this, because the rest of the cast have a sort of retrograde amnesia effect applied to them that has just made them forget that Pomni was ever a cast member like them. Though unlike in Spider-Man Brand New Day where that's used effectively as a plot device, this one doesn't handle it as well. As has been said thousands of times at this point, Digital Circus is a show about the characters' interactions with each other and how those interactions change each of them. Pomni's arrival to the circus has a fundamental impact on the way that every single character in the show behaves, and removing the foundation of that development harms the rest of the cast. Now, changing this would require a full rewrite of the AU and its rules, but that is because it is a fundamental problem with the idea of this comic. 8 out of 15. Encore has a lot of work to do with all of these new characters that have been added back into the circus. Specifically, the way that Queenie, Kaufmo, and Ribbit interact with the current circus members, and Jax's apology to pretty much everyone. Thankfully, however, it does have a single olive branch from Goose to hold on to here. That being the confirmation that, should they have interacted, Pomni and Ribbit would have been very close with each other. The official take on this relationship goes even further in this direction, but as I've said, this is a Funny Bunny comic, so that obviously won't happen. Instead, we get a Ribbit who is very invested in Pomni's well-being and making sure that Jax doesn't screw with her again, which is a very nice way to take this relationship. The inclusion of the stargazing scene that removes Jax from the equation somewhat is also very helpful here. Queenie also participates in this, but to a lesser extent. It seems that she's mostly here just to give Kinga some closure, as he doesn't get a lot of time in this comic. As for Kaufmo, he picks up the role of the funny one, since Jax is made to be a lot more contemplative and passive due to the events of episode 9. Kaufmo is just funny enough to make him not irritating, but he's not exactly a comedic genius, which fits well with what we know about the rest of the cast's opinion of him. Now, onto the main thing that you really need to get right here. Jax. Having his life saved and now the chance for a do-over he would never get in canon, Jax finally drops the post-bedroom conversation mask he'd put up and goes on his apology tour to all of the cast members, starting with Ribbit. This scene is done very well for a few reasons. One, the apology that Jax gives is awful, terribly worded and cheesier than the chocolate milk I left in my car last week. This is very in line with Jax as a character, who comes from a background where apologies aren't very common, and also where he hasn't given a proper one in literal years. He shouldn't be good at them, and he isn't, but he does try. And that is the second thing that's done well here. Ribbit accepts his apology despite how terrible it is because she knows him. Both sides of him, so even this small event means a lot more to her than it may be to someone like Zooble or Gangle. The reason Ribbit abstracted was she felt that Jax would never try and work things out with her, that she had lost her best friend in the circus forever. She didn't hold hostility over the event, she just wanted to move past it, so there is no world where she would turn down a genuine chance for that to happen. The actual romance scenes with Pomni are cheesy and goopy and all the other fluffy adjectives, so how much you enjoy that will come down heavily to personal preference, but the rest of the comic is very well characterized, and the two do stay in character for all of those scenes. 14 out of 15. I'm gonna come out swinging with Control-C, so bear with me, but Annabelle's situation here is an allegory for gender dysmorphia. You are stuck in a body that you don't feel is your own, you don't like, and you are constantly uncomfortable with. Immediately, this is a good piece of symbolism that provides an alternate representation of the phenomenon than what we see with Zooble, who is free to change things about themselves but never finds something that feels completely right. Zooble is more closely aligned with non-binary individuals, who tend to not like being seen as either end of the gender spectrum, while Anne's situation is more typical of an FTM or MTF trans person. Immediately, we get solid characterization of the new cast member. What's interesting about this though is the rest of the cast is remarkably similar in writing style to the canon. The comic seems very focused on what the actual characters would do in a situation where a new face was added, rather than altering the way that the current members behave, which is a big positive for fans of canon. To take an example, let's have a look at Kane. He is immediately determined to make Annabelle match as close to Ragatha as is physically possible, even using typical computer naming conventions to label this new human. This first shows his detachment for what humans value, because to him there is no difference in the levels of individuality between the two name options. If you dig a little deeper, however, you can spot Kane's own selfish interest peeking through here. Ragatha is the second longest surviving member of the circus, and has been there years longer than the next person. If Kane's goal, as we see it in the show before episode 8, is to get the humans to like him and not leave him alone, then having another version of a human who has stayed with him for about a decade now is incredibly valuable. Of course, he doesn't understand how humans work, so he thinks that keeping Anne as close to being like Ragatha as possible will make her last the same amount of time. 12 out of 15.
Hey, I'm always down to make art together if you want.
The art style for Replacement Code is lovely to look at. It's very consistent both between the individual panels and the comic chapters, with the style feeling very fitting for the digital circus. It's not quite as sharp as Goose's own work, with all the characters feeling a little bit more rounded, but that doesn't really detract from anything. Scar has also taken the time to fully colour and render the entire comic, which does give it extra points over something like Encore, which chooses not to do this. The colouring is used well here too, with it being for the most part very vibrant and happiness/excitement coded. This then contrasts with some select scenes that are done in very dark environments, sometimes even in complete grayscale. The juxtaposition of these frames with the rest of the comic really sells these dramatic moments and makes up for the fact that the writing is less emphatic since it has been translated. I also can't talk about this art style without mentioning the character design changes. Obviously Pomni received a complete redesign, but the rest of the characters also have slight details that reference her. Kinga's cloak has a red and blue layer, Zooble has a different patch on their torso, Gangle's ribbon has blue mixed in, Ragatha has new stockings, and Jax has a new glove. These small details show that Kane's death and replacement has permanently altered the circus here, and drives home the alternate in this alternate universe. The only minor criticism I can give here is the backgrounds. They aren't very creative, and these odd curved horizon lines appear a lot. As a flat earther myself, I cannot stand the sight of curves, so I'll have to knock a point off the score. 9 out of 10. The art style for Encore is a relatively simple one, done in complete grayscale with basic shading. That being said, the essence of the characters is portrayed very well through all of these simplified designs, and the posing and facial expressions are top notch. Specifically, the way that Freak uses the eyes of characters is very high level, and you can get a lot of emotion just from that. I should also take the time to note that this comic was produced ridiculously fast. It is 338 panels long and was posted in its entirety in less than 3 weeks. That is absurd levels of speed for this sort of quality, and is probably the reason reason no color was used. I will unfortunately have to detract a couple points from the overall score though because of my biggest hatred in all of comics: numbered text bubbles. The text bubbles in general in this comic do need some work. Some feel squished into corners and others have way too much space. This is likely a side effect of the choice to post each small panel as its own individual image without allowing for overlap, but it's an artistic choice which means it can be criticized. I'll also throw in a little shade at the handwritten text within the bubbles, which is sometimes wonky and sometimes more difficult to read, but it's legible enough for the most part. 7 out of 10. Control C is an odd one to talk about the art style of because the art style changes a fair bit within the comic itself. I suppose you could already count that as a criticism, but regardless, let's take a closer look. The majority of this comic is done in a simple sketch style, very similar to that of Encore but with Thwarp's unique sketching. This includes a lot more squash and stretch of the characters into wildly goofy expressions, which for the digital circus is very fitting. The design of Kane is the most evident example of this. He has been permanently shrunk, with his torso now way smaller than it was in the show. It honestly reminds me of Cosmo and Wanda from Fairly OddParents, which I think is what they were going for. As for the few panels which are actually coloured, they're done so for explicit story reasons, like when Kane chooses a new colour palette for Annabelle to make her more distinct. It's a nice detail for what he would do, but we don't get to see it for most of the comic, so its use is kind of lost on the audience. Something I will give Thwarp major props for though is their use of actual A4 page layouts instead of individual panels in sequence like the other two comics. Not only that, but it's used well and is consistent with proper comic styling and reading conventions, meaning that this was the easiest comic out of all the ones I've reviewed, including all the Murder Drones ones, for me to actually read. But again, the inconsistencies with the way the comic is drawn are quite off-putting, and make the coloured panels, which are definitely the best looking ones, feel out of place.
Ah, a YouTuber.
Not really. Nobody watched them.
Replacement Code, unfortunately, is not published on many platforms other than its official release on Tumblr, which is a theme we're going to see for all three of these. However, because of its age and initial popularity, there have been quite a few posts on YouTube surrounding this comic. The most complete dub I can find is from Will Starshine, and while the microphone quality is questionable, the dubbing itself is good enough. In a first for these sorts of things though, we also have some proper animations made about the AU that aren't strictly done by the creator, and you can also go see those on YouTube. 7 out of 10. Encore is again only viewable primarily on Instagram. There is, as is the case for every piece of digital circus media ever, a Reddit upload, but that's not from the original creator. Freak also does have a Patreon with access to future comics early and some NSFW stuff, but for the most part it is just Instagram for the main comic. How about dubs then? Well, I need to be a little bit careful here. There is a dub of Encore on YouTube, and it's pretty easy to find. However, I cannot in good consciousness recommend it or link it anywhere, because the person who made it is sort of infamous in my circle. The kind of infamy that causes people to make half-hour-long video essays going over your abusive tendencies. The kind of infamy that's caused him to change his name multiple times since I last made any comment regarding him, but who was once known as Drone Throne. Do with that information what you will. Control C is even more similar to Replacement Code, as it also primarily released on Tumblr without having any other platforms except for Reddit. There doesn't appear to be an official dub for this comic, but there is an unofficial one made by Ezra Dubs of the entire piece. He also plays all of the roles himself in the dub, which is mighty impressive vocal range, even if some of it does lack expressiveness because he's already pushing his voice. 6 out of 10.
On board! Let's go to the next adventure!
But you're not even a part of.
So, there is the review for all three. Now, let's take a look at the final scores. Replacement Code finished with a tally of 31 out of 45. Encore scored 31 as well. And Control C ended up on... Wait, really? I promise, this was not intentional at all. I did each of the sections of this script on different days and was not keeping track of the totals throughout, but all three comics have an identical score of 31. So where does that leave us? Well, I suppose then it comes down to your personal preference, because having read all of these, I can recommend all of them. If you want a story that has a fantastic premise and deviation from the canon of the show, then check out Replacement Code. If you want something that delves deep into the characters without caring too much for past consequences, then have a look at Encore and its sequel, which wasn't included in this video. Finally, if you want a balance of different elements that feels good on the eyeballs, then go read Control C. But that's all I've got for today. Thank you all for watching, and have a good one.